What's up, everybody? It is Izzy. We are back again today with a Q&A. This time there's actually some training footage in it. We have some push work. What you'll find out here is I made a slight adjustment to my last push session where I basically did nothing but unilateral training. I don't want to get too far away from some of the adaptations that I've made on bilateral presses. So while most of my push training is still going to be unilateral while I'm dealing with whatever this weird imbalance is, I'm going to keep at least one set of some stable bilateral pressing so that I stay close to that peak strength that I built and I don't have to rebuild it as soon as I fix this imbalance. On to the first question. Do you like the seated lateral more than the standing one? Yes, I do. They're both good and you should use both over time, but really all shoulder exercises are a little better seated in my opinion. You get more stability, it's the exact same range of motion, and most people can do anywhere from like 2.5 to 10% more weight depending on what type of shoulder movement that we're talking about. It's very common for someone to do like a seated shoulder press and be able to get 3 or 4 more reps at the same weight than they could if they did it standing. And again, there's no change in range of motion. You're not using any other muscle to lift that weight, so it's just better shoulder stimulus, period. Do you think side delt fatigue would be likely to interfere with pressing if done the next day? So it's super important to remember that if you do any training at all the day before you train something else, that will have an interference. So that's why on a push-pull leg split, for example, you should do whichever one of those triads of muscle groups is the weakest, you should train first. For me, it's push. That's why I train push always after an off day. Now, as far as local fatigue interference from having tired side delts, it's not going to make a big difference to your pressing. I mean, I do laterals first in my push workout, and it costs me maybe a rep, probably not even a rep on my first movement, which is a shoulder press. So it won't be a huge interference effect.
Bro, come on. If you want like scientific textbook level answers, just Google it, and you'll be able to Google it and it'll say on Google, how does caffeine work? Caffeine works by blocking adenosine receptors, blah, 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 blah. But basically that's how caffeine works, right? It doesn't just give you energy. It literally makes it so that you can't get to a certain level of calmness. So that's why it keeps you out of a parasympathetic state, because caffeine has a half-life of generally 4 hours. For some people it's 8, depending on which genes that you have. So you have this long period of time that caffeine is being processed in your system where it's literally preventing you from calming down and going into a lower state of arousal. That's how it does that.
I don't know who needs to hear this, but you should not be losing a ton of strength while you're dieting. Yes, even if you're natural. Sure, maybe a rep or two, especially on high rep movements, because you're not going to have as much glycogen in your system. But you really don't have your leverages affected by weight loss until you've lost 5 to 10% of your body weight. You don't really start losing extreme amounts of strength until you get to extreme leanness. So if you're dieting from a moderate body fat to a leanish body fat, if you're dieting at a slow, moderate pace, you shouldn't be losing a ton of strength. And if you are, you don't know what you're doing, programming-wise. I am not recovering, as evidenced by having delayed onset muscle soreness from 2 sets of stiff-legged deadlifts on Saturday. Should I decrease hamstring volume for this? Personally, I don't put that much stock into DOMs. I know it's a very big part of the Renaissance periodization model, but I don't find it to be a very high-quality proxy. How's your performance? Are you still setting stiff leg PRs? If so, it doesn't really matter. Are you still getting like leg curl PRs in your next hamstring session? If so, it doesn't really matter. I've had periods where my lower back was sore like every day, and I would still set squat and deadlift PRs. So performance overall. What causes one to feel flat during a workout or in general? Is it all carb, sodium, timing, and intake? No, it's just fatigue, man. Just general amorphous fatigue. Nothing in particular. It could be any of a million reasons. Poor sleep, poor hydration, bad mood, whatever. If it was actually from being depleted of electrolytes, it would be a much more serious issue. If you actually hit zero muscle glycogen and bonked, like runners do during long runs, you would know, because that's like a crazy lightheaded type feeling that's almost similar to going hypo. It's not just feeling like, man, I don't really have like enough, as much drive as usual. I can't really like get into my last gear like I normally can. So the general feeling that people call feeling flat is just a feeling of not having as much energy and explosion as normal, and that is just fatigue. I'll just assume that you're pretty new to the Q&A because I've gone over this like many times, but failure training is not appropriate for powerlifting or any other sport that has a technical optimization aspect, and that is because failure training is going to, yes, even on accessories, so I'm not saying like do your SBD with RAR and then do accessories to failure either. Failure training is going to cause too much central fatigue, and it will greatly limit the volume and the frequency that you can use, which is important for a sport where you need to have technical mastery and the highest rates of neurological optimization possible. So failure training is counterproductive for powerlifting, weightlifting, strongman, anything with technique. Will you do a second set to failure on your rear delt fly or leave some reps in reserve? I wouldn't just randomly start doing RIR training out of nowhere. So I only keep reps in reserve on certain movements if I have a proven recovery problem that I think keeping reps in reserve will solve. So a good example of that might be, let's say one set isn't enough and 2 sets is too much to failure. That is, maybe I would do 2 sets with 1 to 2 RIR and see if that's enough stimulus to be in between 1 set to failure and 2 sets to failure, if that makes sense. But I'm not randomly just going to throw in sets with RIR training when my entire training model and my entire training paradigm is based on going to failure. Interesting thing to note, I guess, at least to me, on these unilateral chest flies, there really isn't much of a gap anymore. You'll see that on the next set. This is my supposed weak side, my right side. So I'm really thinking it's maybe less to do with a muscular imbalance and more to do with some sort of dysfunction in my upper back on the right side. Does nicotine inhibit muscle mass accrual? In like chewable form and patches, probably not. Smoking, it seems to, yes. Smoking in general seems to inhibit fractional muscle protein synthesis rates, and it seems to upregulate the production of myostatin, or turning on myostatin genes. So overall, nicotine probably not a big deal. It's a useful stimulant in some cases for performance enhancing reasons, but as far as actually smoking, that is probably not good for your muscle gains, as well as not being good in general. Like, especially if you're somebody who is doing PEDs, smoking cigarettes and PEDs together to basically comorbidities. Who am I to judge whether anybody wants to live, but are you trying to die early? Because that's a great combo to do so. Anyway, next question. When did you cross over from powerlifting to bodybuilding training? Apparently May 8th, 2019. You can see the picture that I put up here. It's probably more interesting than my word answer of my first cycle and my first month of doing bodybuilding training. Next question. I don't think habit creation is universal. It's not going to be the same for every single person. Some people will be less, and some people it'll be more. Some people it'll be for less time. Some people it'll be for more time. But I would say, if I'm just going to pull some numbers out of my ass, something like 3 times a week for 6 months would get most people to have a habit that lasts quite a long time. Talking about how many days a week would you need to go to the gym to make it habitual? How much of a difference in blending my oatmeal meal and drinking it over eating it in a bowl? None. 0. It's the exact same food with a slightly different preparation. Nothing. No difference at all. None. This is a follow-up on how does nicotine inhibit muscle growth, and does it also apply to enhanced lifters? Yes, enhanced lifters don't have different physiology than natural lifters. Yes, they can get away with more stuff, but the same basic thing is going to apply. A negative is a negative. Now, if you're interested in like the evidence behind what I said, there's actually a journal picture here on the screen. Are you competing soon in bodybuilding? Ideally, I would like to compete this summer or in the fall. I'd most likely probably be ready in the fall. The only reason I haven't committed to signing up for a show in that time period is because I'm currently living on the East Coast of the U.S. in Boston, and my lease is up sometime in August. And the general idea right now that I'm having is I will probably move back to California on the West Coast of the U.S., and that's like a week-long plus drive for those who don't know U.S. geography that well. And I don't want to be in the middle of a prep trying to drive across the country, as that just sounds like a recipe for having a failed prep. So as soon as I can be sure of what my personal life is going to be like logistically, I'll be able to pick a show, but it's definitely sometime in the next 12 months for sure. Is your weaker quad adductor on the knee that you injured during summer? Or do you think there's a different cause? So for those who are unaware, I injured my knee not having a spotter on a hack squat. I failed the rep and I couldn't get out, so I kind of just sank to the bottom and hurt my right knee a little bit. And no, my right leg is actually the strong leg right now, so it's something to do with my left hip injury. This left hip injury has led to me favoring my right leg, and my left leg has lost a lot of strength. So that's what's going on there. Is the 60-degree incline your stable bilateral chest movement? I don't really think in these terms. To me, the 60-degree incline is a compound press. It trains chest, shoulders, and triceps. And if anything that's being biased, it's the shoulders. I mean, look at the video here. You can see, in my opinion, this is more of a shoulder press than a chest press. In powerlifting, there isn't going to be any such thing as stale lifts. It's a completely different programming paradigm. For powerlifting is a sport that requires an extremely high level of specialization, and because of that, you're going to need long-range, long-term planning and periodization. Powerlifters are going to have off-season periods and in-season periods. Off-season periods will generally have a completely different focus. Usually the primary focus is hypertrophy for most powerlifters. During an in-season competition peak, that could be anywhere from 8 to 20 weeks, depending on the advancement of the athlete, and they're going to spend that time peaking towards new SBD maxes. If you're going an entire in-season and off-season cycle without making any progress, then your programming is a complete and utter failure, and it needs to be reevaluated from top to bottom. But in powerlifting, you're never going to be expected to make microcycle to microcycle progression all year round. So there is no such thing as a stale lift. It's just a completely different paradigm than bodybuilding training. All right, everybody, that is it for today. If you ever want to participate in the Q&As, just head over to Instagram, go to my story. There's a question box that's up almost 24/7, and you just click on it and you type in your question. If you like the video, comment any questions below. Subscribe if you haven't already. Have a great day.